With the election only 3 weeks out, every morning on the Pacific Breakfast Show, we are looking at the issues, the candidates, the parties, policies and stories to give you, our Radio 531 PI listeners, as much information to make an informed decision come election day, the 23rd of September. And it is a very warm welcome to Ruthie, our senior reporter for Pacific Radio News. How are you doing, sister?
Good, thank you, Brian.
Good indeed, very good.
A little bit cold.
Yes, a little bit cold. Now, as part of our election 2017 countdown this morning, we welcome to the show the Right Honourable Vaovasamanaia Winston Peters, New Zealand First Party leader and MP for Northland. A long and storied career in politics spanning almost 40 years with roles as former Deputy Prime Minister, former Minister for Foreign Affairs and former Minister for Māori Affairs, to name a few. A very warm welcome to the show this morning, Mr. Peters.
Good morning.
Good morning. Well, let's start with those hard-hitting questions to begin with, Mr. Peters. You are an avid fisherman. If we were looking at Election Day 2017, what is the catch we are looking for New Zealand First? A trout or a marlin or whatever?
Well, just the full quota, but not illegally.
For sure, Mr. Peters. Well, Mr. Peters, great to have you. And once again, as I said, a very storied career. One of the comments I'd like to start with from the leaders' debate the other night, which I very much thought was, a great compliment to yourself. Bill English himself said that you know politics inside out over 40 years. In saying that, both of the leaders said that should they go into coalition with yourself after this year's election, they don't want you anywhere near the purse strings. Why are they saying that?
No, they didn't say that at all. What they said was, without telling you the facts, was that they've already promised a job to someone else, which is a rather dangerous thing to do when you're going into negotiations. But you remember that this was the debate on TV3?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. The amazing thing about that was there was a section to talk about Winston Peters, but they didn't have the integrity to put me on the show to talk about it myself. I thought that was actually amazing. If you're going to have a section about Winston Peters, the decent professional thing to do would be to put the person on so he can speak for himself. But no, they didn't. All three went about it as though the person who wasn't there, they could speak for, which I thought was astonishing. Maybe they should have a bit more courage and be prepared to debate me, not rule me out because they're too scared to.
On that note, Mr. Peters, are you going to be participating in the Friday night minor party leader debate?
Well, let me tell you this, and I've got to make a decision this morning about that, and my staff are sending the information, but it was never presented to me as anything other than an all-party debate with the following criteria. If people and parties met it, they would be on. If they didn't, they wouldn't. And so we went all the way through being told that there was an all-party debate, national, Labour, the whole 100 yards. And then at the last minute, just 2 days ago, later in the day, I get told that what I've been told in writing is not true. I kind of think that's pretty awful, really. And my question to them is, well, why do you allow Labour National to say, I won't debate with Winston Peters and get away with it? In the UK, the BBC forced Theresa May, the Prime Minister, to debate, forced Mr Cameron before that to debate when he was the Prime Minister. But no, in New Zealand, they make a promise. We're going to have an all-parties debate. And when two people say, no, we won't join up with them, then they start compromising. And that's just dreadful. If you're good enough and you're prepared to debate and you're prepared to defend what you're saying, turn up. But here we've got a circus going on now where some are out, some are in, some are going to court, and some nobody knows who they are.
Kia ora, sir. Your immigration policy, that has stoked the fire in many quarters. Some might say that you're kind of stepping a little bit in human rights platform, breaching it, if I might say so. Some might say you're racist, but you're certainly looking ahead to the well-being and the preservation of New Zealand jobs, the economy. Do you want to just quickly outline for us the main focus of your policy on immigration?
Well, anyone that says that my policy is unconstitutional or illegal is not a lawyer. and they're just making up a lousy excuse to try and get because they're not prepared to defend what they argue is the right policy against us. Let me tell you this. What chance have your listeners got, or for that matter, the mass majority of New Zealanders, new or old, of getting a house if you have 73,000 hopping off the planet Mana every year, and you're only going to build 10,000 houses a year? The average house numbers would be, depending around the country, but the average house numbers would be well under 4 people per house. So if you build 10,000 houses, that's 40,000 people. There's a crisis that none of these parties are addressing. They're saying they've got a housing policy, but they won't even house the ones getting off the plane. That's my point. And so all those people who believe them are not being told the truth. You will not get a house under our construction program, or these parties' construction program, because they're not building enough. They're not seeing it as a crisis it is. And that's the terrible thing. Now, the second thing is, what we have always argued for is an immigration policy like every other country has, where you bring in people who've got the skills and can get jobs and can get homes. And the way we did out of the Pacific Island and elsewhere in the 50s or 60s or 70s, everybody was happy about it. And back then we were building more houses with 3 million people than we're building now with almost 5 million. So, it's one thing to believe what these politicians say. The other thing is get behind the facts, or as they say, lift up the bonnet and have a look at the motor, and you find there's no motor there. Now, our Pacific quota, all those things to do with seasonal employment out of the Pacific, which is something I started 10 years ago, remember? You wouldn't think so, listen to my critics. All those things will continue in those critical jobs. But if you bring in, as we have done, 10,000 chefs in the last 5 years, that's more than all the restaurants we got by about 1,500, by 1,500. If you bring in that many chefs, do you think you've got an immigration program, a skills program, or have you got somebody using that occupation as the back door for entry? And we've seen it in student education and offshore export education, people being ripped off. And New Zealand First is saying none of this is in the interest of the people here, whether they got here yesterday or they got here 1,000 years ago, as the Maori people did. It's just all so wrong, and we've got the courage to say so. The rest, the touchy-feely, all this is fantastic, excepting out there the struggle is real, and the housing and homelessness is a crisis. You've got waiting lists for hospital waiting lists. You've got children being taught in corridors and in school libraries. Everywhere you look, infrastructure, lack of roading, railways, lack of police, lawlessness. And they say this is all fine. Now, they can get away with that if people don't look and examine the substance behind what they're saying.
So you've enjoyed the support of Great Power, the seniors and our elderly in New Zealand for a long, long time. Our Pacific baby boomers are reaching retirement age at the moment, and we are 10 years under the life expectancy rate for the rest of New Zealand. I wonder if you could, it's for some of us, affording a plush apartment in the Ryan Group is a little bit beyond our reach. And asking our New Zealand-born young generation to look after the mamas and the papas at home is a big ask as well. What kind of policies would you have to help our Pacific aging population to retire, content? I mean, we've worked hard all our lives, and then what do we look forward to?
Well, you see, you're referring to different cultural values, which are very admirable, because it's not the Pacific way to abandon our parents and lead them to the so-called free market, dog-eat-dog circumstances, and high cost at that. I mean, I'm from a family of 11 children who looked after their mother and father, never went to an institution, but looked after their mother and father as they should, and we all do, because we've got an obligation to. I mean, that's our way. And we would ensure that people who were from the Pacific background had sufficient support within their family settings to be able to live not dependent upon the state and dependent on the isolation, but with families. That's the nature and the joy of life. And the last thing the Pacific people wanted to do is to be farmed off to some place where they're strangers, no companionship, and none of the cultural joy of their past life. That's a horrible outcome, and I understand that. seriously understand it from my personal background and also from the Pacific background.
Mr. Peters, we've got, about 3-4 minutes, but we want to make the most of our time with you. Let's change tack now to GST, looking at GST off food and GST off rates. Can you tell us a bit more about the taxation policy of New Zealand First?
Well, you've got GST on part of your rates bill, which is a tax on a tax, which is simply, in my view, unconstitutional, it's illegal, and it's a very ordinary exercise in plain Treasury and Inland Revenue Department deception supported by politicians. So I'm going to remove the component that is a tax on tax in terms of GST on rates. And then because it's essential for hard-up people that they be able to live with some decency and with the decent food that they need. And we're in a very high-cost economy at the moment, where food costs over the last 25 years have just gone up and up and up, and somebody needs to do something about it. We're going to say we're taking GST off basic foods. And as I said at the time, and before this bunch of bureaucrats and experts start saying what's basic foods, then why don't you go and ask your grandmother? She knows. How come you don't?
Mr. Peters, Member of Parliament for Northland, I want you to quickly go over, the state of Northland in terms of the poverty, the suicide rates, which are much higher than any area in New Zealand. What are they saying to you? What are your constituents saying in Northland?
Well, they're the hard and sorry evidence of what I've been saying for a long time and why I won the by-election up there in March of 2015. I went there. I didn't have to, but I'm from up north, and I went in the campaign and said, look, all the signs say that you've been utterly forgotten and neglected, and for decades now. You're in the top half of the export wealth-creating electorates in New Zealand, and the bottom of everything else, and all the other social indicators are terrible. And people have been making promises to you for years, never delivered on anything much. And I'm going to change that. And what's changed now is that we've got the country's attention, the political attention of all the political parties has changed, and that's only to the good. But my point is, we want all of our raw products there, forestry, farming, all sorts of agriculture, horticulture, and aquaculture and fishing. We want those resources in factories and added value businesses in the north. Everything we see there at the moment is the very worst way to construct an economy. And the north shows the results of it. For example, you see all the logs thundering down a highway on huge trucks, which are breaking up the roads, which we can't afford to maintain, going straight to Northport and off overseas to some other economy where they add all the value and all the jobs and all the wealth. And the same thing happens with our meat industry. Most of the animals are not killed or slaughtered up north, but go elsewhere. So that's also a loss of jobs and profits and wealth in the north. And then you've got the milk industry, the same thing. And then you look elsewhere and they're highly taxed. So what we're saying is, no, like so many regions in this country, you've been Cinderella-ized and marginalised, and we're going to take the political system on to fix it up. That's what I'm saying. And then you'll start seeing some of these horrible figures like the suicide rate, like the dependency on drugs and, the forgotten youth and generation of homelessness. You'll see these stats start to change around. How do I know that? Well, I grew up when there was no unemployment up there, when everybody was working. The whole place was thriving. We had the Whangarei Glass Works, the Whangarei Fertiliser Works. The government money was being printed up north. We had factories everywhere, milk factories, dairy factories everywhere, and everybody, Maori and European, all employed. Now, what we've seen is an economic policy that has dislocated, tipped so many Maori and, dare I say it, Islanders out of the system, and they're scratching their head wondering why. It's all in front of their face. If only they'd give up their stupid political ideology and start realising that the economy is about people. And if you beat people out, then you're going to have huge problems. And we should not be surprised at those problems, because that's what the inevitability is.
Well, a very big thank you. I'm sorry that's all we've got time for. The Right Honourable Winston Peters, Member for Parliament of Northland and also Leader of New Zealand First. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Well, thank you for the chance to talk to your listeners.
Thank you.
Now, don't forget, come the 23rd, keep the faith, eh?
Keep the faith indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.